Without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Dan Draper, Product Marketing Manager.
Thank you very much, Kim. I will be serving as the moderator for today's session. I have the product marketing responsibility for Syniverse's risk management solution area. And on behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. I'm going to introduce the speakers in a minute, but before I do that, I'd just like to cover off a few topics so that we can all settle in to today's session. The first point I want to bring up is the fact that we will be conducting a poll during the webinar. It's an incredibly easy to understand mechanic. The questions appear on the screen and it's self-evident how you respond to those. But the poll is all about helping us assess the validity of a concept we've been working on for a few months in terms of establishing a consistent method by which we could measure the value of fraud prevented in financial terms. We're interested in this because it would certainly help us to illustrate to our customers the value of our solutions that they're investing in. And we suspect that it could be relevant to our audience in terms of the conversations you may have with your CFO to evidence the contribution that your own fraud mitigation strategies are bringing to your organization. And actually, with the body of people we have on the call today, we have a fleeting but kind of unique opportunity to get your feedback on that potential mechanism. So I'm very keen that you should participate. The results are interactive, which I'm looking forward to seeing, but please take reassurance in the fact that they are an aggregation. So in that respect, they are highly confidential. We will not be able to tell who has responded on which particular point. In addition to the poll, we also have a quiz, and to avoid confusion, I'll just make the distinction between those two sort of sets of questions. The quiz is entirely personal and private to you. It's, relatively speaking, much more light-hearted, and we put that in there to engage you and focus your minds on what will be coming up in terms of our globally amassed empirical data, and really gives you an opportunity to stress test your own assumptions on how fraud manifests it around the world. And the quiz actually comes up before the poll. It's not all about us asking you questions. You get the opportunity to supply questions by the Q&A facility that Kim mentioned. In the first session we held today, we had a lot of questions, and we will try very hard to manage their responses in real time today. But if we don't do that, please don't think we've forgotten you, because we will get back to you subsequently via email. And please do make the most use of that facility as you wish. Further from Kim mentioning about the fact that you will receive a recording of this session, as attendees of the webinar, you will also have access to the associated report, the second in our Global Fraud Trends series. This effectively mirrors the content that you'll see presented today, so please don't feel the need to make a record of any facts or figures that you're interested in. So over to our speakers now. The session will be led by James Stewart, who is a director in the product management team of our risk management area. James has many years experience in the design and implementation of fraud management solutions. He's been at Syniverse for 8 years. Prior to that, he spent a chunk of his career at Fair Isaac, where he was actually involved in the design of Neartrade. James is probably familiar to quite a few of you in his capacity as chairman of the GSMA Roaming and Interconnect Fraud and Security Group. Supporting James today is Jason Tikikara. He was a senior product manager in James's group. Jason, again, involved on a daily basis in the design and implementation of fraud management solutions. Prior to Syniverse, he had senior roles at Subex, both in the engineering and consulting teams. Jason is also a certified fraud examiner. So I now pass over to James who will take you through today's agenda. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. So I'll start by looking at the agenda, but just before I get into detail in the agenda, I just wanted to set a little bit of context around this. This presentation, it's largely about statistics, which sounds very dull, but these are exciting statistics. This is information we believe you'll find useful. I hope you'll want to hear more about it in the future, and we welcome your feedback as the presentation goes on. As Dan was mentioning, listening to this presentation, we've got some very useful, some great knowledge amongst you there, very useful people. So you've all got valuable opinions, and we'd welcome your feedback. And if you don't ask questions during the presentation, at the end I'll be putting up email addresses for me and to Jason, and you're welcome to get in touch with us directly if there's more you'd like to ask us. So if you work for an operator, your CFO is concerned about profitability. Now, he can hardly expect the fraud department to bring in revenue, but he will be looking for what cost savings you can bring and what he can expect from the fraud department. So we're all expected to work smarter. We're expected to find fraud faster and to reduce the losses and increase profitability. That gives us two problems. Firstly, how do we find fraud faster? And for that, we need to understand the marketplace. We need to understand patterns of fraud that are out there at the moment. And hence, it's also useful to understand the trends. What kinds of fraud are increasing, decreasing, what frauds in what locations are changing. Trends are very important. So, for example, in terms of patterns of fraud you'd want to understand, if you know that roamers in Spain are making repeated calls to Ecuador, and if you know that's a pattern which has a high probability of fraud, then you could set profiles in your fraud management system to detect that where repeated calls are involved. So if we can find fraud faster, we can stop it faster. If we stop it faster, the value of fraud found is actually going to reduce. For example, if we know that an hour of fraud might cost us $100 and we stop it within half an hour, that's just $50. The faster we stop it, the less value there is associated with it. So it becomes harder and harder to justify our existence to our CFO. So actually, what's important is how much fraud have you actually saved the company from? And that's difficult to justify the statistics you come up with if you do it alone. But if you can say this is what the industry typically does, then you're in a much stronger position to say this is the way it should be calculated, I'm doing it in an acceptable way in which everyone's calculating it, and so it helps to agree something between operators. It also helps you to compare yourself to trends in your region, to other operators around the world. So looking at trends is a very helpful thing to do. So as far as the agenda is concerned, I'm going to start just by giving you a little bit more context to tell you about the data sources we're using. We'll have a quiz to just to set some expectations on the information you're going to hear. And then we'll get into the statistics, and I'll hand off to Jason, who will be able to drill down into more detail. And if you've got questions for him, you'd like to know more detail in a particular area, please do submit those questions through the question facility. And then later on, we'll have the webinar poll, and at that time, I'm going to talk about the measurement of the value of fraud prevented, how we can measure it, how we can establish trends in that area. And then we'll reserve some time for Q&A at the end. So moving into the context and the background. In general, operators have a very healthy appetite for sharing information as far as fraud is concerned. I regularly attend the GSMA fraud and security group meetings. I attend CFCA, and in all these meetings, there is a very good appetite for sharing information. People are extremely helpful in providing guidance. So if you don't attend those meetings, I do strongly recommend it. It's not just regular conferences. These are meetings for information sharing and for building networks. But in those sessions, you establish a good sense that people want to share information, but we also want to standardize the language we use and the type of data we share. So this webinar is about providing more data on fraud trends based on fraud statistics that we gather from our customers. So the data we use is based on the customers we have in cloud-based fraud management. Now, we have customers who have both cloud-based fraud management, and we provide on-site fraud solutions as well. We provide cloud-based fraud management for roaming fraud detection and for domestic. But what we've chosen to do here is focus just on roaming, because that gives us a much better distribution of countries all around the world, and to focus just on voice-based data. So we have about 120 mobile operators as customers of cloud-based fraud detection. And for roaming, we'll use that data, and we've chosen a data set of about 10,000 cases, and we're just looking at the number of cases that apply to different scenarios. And in those 10,000 cases, they're distributed around about 150 countries around the globe. Now, also to get the language straight here, to understand the terminology, I'd just like to clarify that when we talk about the home country, in the roaming sense, here we're talking about the country of the HPMN. That is a country where the subscriber's original service provider is based, where the subscriber comes from. They are then roaming to a particular country, which would be the VPMN, the Visited Network country, and that is where calls are originated. So we have the originating country is the origination of calls, and then the calls are terminated in the terminating country. And we'll use this terminology throughout this presentation. So starting with a subscriber coming from their home country, making calls from originating calls from the originating country, and then terminating those calls in the terminating country. And we'll repeat this graphic so you understand exactly what it is we're referring to when we look at these areas. Now, the quiz. This is just to get you thinking a little bit to yourself about what you expect from this presentation. Just some simple questions. We use very similar questions when we've done a similar presentation to this with the CFCA. So the first one is really to ask what level of fraud you have at the weekend compared to weekdays. Would you expect fraud at the weekend to be higher or similar to weekdays, or would it be lower at weekends? Do the fraudsters take time off at weekends? Just make your own assessment of that. And for simplicity, we're going to consider a weekend to be Friday, Saturday, Sunday, since in some parts of the world, Friday is part of the weekend. The next question is, which month would you expect to be the peak of the number of fraud cases? Would you expect it to peak in the summer? Or maybe would you expect it to peak in the winter? But here's a complication. This is about global statistics. And if we talk about summer in the northern hemisphere, clearly it's going to be winter in the southern hemisphere, and do the two cancel each other out so that the statistics become relatively flat through the seasons? Or is there more fraud that occurs in the northern hemisphere, so we see more influence on the fraud statistics in the northern hemisphere compared to the southern hemisphere? We will see. And the next one, which month would you expect to be the lowest for the number of fraud cases? Similarly, is it going to be winter, summer? What do you think? Which country would you expect to be struck by most cases of fraud? So if you are an operator, as the home operator, would you expect your country to be struck by more cases than anywhere else, or other countries? Think about where you think they have a bigger problem. And then the final question, which countries would you expect to have the most cases for originating call fraud? That is, where people originate their calls. Just something for you to think about. Now, let's get straight into the statistics, and I'll look first of all at the trends around the year. Now, as I mentioned before, this is looking at fraud trends globally. So we have to remember this is covering the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere. So summer in Europe is going to be winter in New Zealand, for example. So as we put up the statistics, I'm going to start with 2013 and then build up with more recent years so that we can see if patterns repeat themselves, because it's only if the patterns repeat themselves that we can say that the data is giving us reliable information. So here we're seeing that there's a bit of a dip around the cold months around February, March, and then it rises. The number of fraud cases rise for the summer period, and then it drops down again at winter, with a bit of a slight rise around the new year. So for 2014, it seems to be repeating itself, which is nice because this tells us the data is, that there's more validity in the data if we see that. Unfortunately, it all goes horribly wrong after that. What we see here is that the data actually decreases around the August timeframe, and then it goes back up again. So this is messing up how repeatable we think the data is, but then there are bound to be anomalies that occur. Now, I don't remember what was in the news at that time in 2014, but it's possible at that time there could have been terrorist attacks, there could have been bird flu or major events which influenced what was going on at that time. So I also know that when the FBI arrested a major perpetrator of fraud involved in international revenue share fraud around 2012, operators at that time reported a big drop in fraud as a result of that arrest. And so there are bound to be some anomalies. So let's see what happens in 2015. Now, 2015 isn't very helpful. There is quite a peak around June, July time. But then it drops down into the fall, and you can see it's a bit of a mixed pattern. I think the message behind these statistics that we're seeing is there is no real reliable trend that you can say we need to have more people in place during the summer months or fewer people in the winter months. You can't really say that, but it changes a little from year to year, and it's going to change from region to region. But we'll keep building up this picture. Soon we'll get the data for 2016, and we'll see what we can make of it then. How about days of the week? What do you think will happen for fraud through the days of the week? Well, it's rising around the weekend. There's a bit of a rise around midweek. Then the fraudsters go off a little bit, and then they get going through the weekend where it peaks. And again, this is just number of fraud cases. For 2014, there's an even more prominent rise of fraud at the weekend. But again, this interesting rise around midweek. I don't know why that is. And finally, for 2015, even more of a rise midweek. So clearly, there seems to be a bit of a peak around Wednesday, but Friday, Saturday, Sunday, it shows that you need to be protected through the weekend. You need to continue to be vigilant at that time. Now, I'm willing to bet that if we were looking at the value of fraud here instead of just the number of cases, it would be even more marked, because what happens at weekends or at holiday times is the fraudsters hope to be able to continue their scam for longer before they're caught, longer calls and so forth. There are going to be higher costs involved in that. And so that's going to exaggerate what you see at weekends even more. Now we're moving into which countries are affected most by fraud. We're going to start with the home country, from where the subscribers came. Then we'll look at originating country, from where calls are originated, and then the terminating country of where calls are terminated. And what you have here in the chart is the orange lines represent our most recent data for the 12-month period ending on 31st of October 2016. But we thought it would be useful to compare it to the data we gathered a few months previously in the 12-month period ending June 2016, just to see if the trends are repeating themselves. And in this case, as we look at the HPMN data, or rather the home country data, we're seeing there is a reasonable repetition. We're seeing that Brazil has quite a serious problem, followed by the UK, and then Mexico, Afghanistan, and so on. Now, at this point, you may be wondering at the data behind this, because if we drill into the data a bit, we could see, if we focused on Brazil, for example, you could see what the originating countries and terminating countries are related specifically to the Brazil data and so on. So this is where I'd like to hand over to Jason, who can work the data, work his magic on the data and get into a bit more detail. So Jason, I'm hoping that you can pick it up.
James, while Jason is setting himself up, we've had a question come in, which you could attend to right now. And do we consider lost or stolen devices as fraud?
Well, yes, you would consider lost or stolen devices as fraud, but the data that we're basing this on is where we have identified fraud occurring. So the value of the device we don't actually see, to be honest. So when we have gathered the statistics, we're just looking at the number of cases that we identify from calling behavior, which doesn't include actual stolen devices. Of course, if a device is stolen in Spain and then IRSF is committed using that device, it'll appear in our statistics. But the fact that the device was stolen doesn't appear.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, that's an interesting scenario, James. What we will do is we will look at the data set and we will try and see if we can find out any such combinations emerging. So once again, thanks, James, for passing on the session to me. As James mentioned, what we are going to have in the next couple of minutes is a walkthrough through an interactive data set. What we have done here is we have taken an interactive application, which works on top of the data set, on the basis of which we have derived those statistics in the presentation. What this interactive application allows you to do is to drill down on specific scenarios. For example, as you could see here, this interactive application is divided into 3 sections. The first on the left side is the home country section. The one in the middle is the originating country, the country where the SIM is roaming, or the country from where the call originated at the time of fraudulent activity, and the terminating country, the country to which the call got terminated, while it was identified as fraud case. As James mentioned, you could see that Brazil, UK, Mexico, and Afghanistan, has retained the top 4 positions for the data set what we have with us. And let's look into a scenario of Brazil. So when we drill down to Brazil, you could see that the data changes itself to the context of Brazil. And you could see, all of a sudden, the mix of originating countries and the mix of terminating countries changes. And what's interesting to note is, if it is not Brazil, United States comes as the top originating country. But from the perspective of Brazil, it's Peru which comes as the top contributor in terms of originating country. In fact, the United States doesn't even come in the top 10 list as far as Brazil or the frauds relating to Brazil are concerned. You would also notice that almost 1/5 of the calls were actually getting terminated. So whenever a Brazilian SIM traveled beyond Brazil and resulted in a fraud, 1 among the 5 calls were actually terminating in Cuba. Now let's look at the next top contender in the home country list, which is United Kingdom. You can see that now Peru is no more in the top 20 originating countries. It's Spain which has taken that position, and in fact, you can see that 1 among the 3 calls, which resulted in the fraud, the calls were originating from Spain. And in terms of a termination, you can see that it's getting spread across multiple countries. At this point in time, I would like to take you to the next concept here, What we have also done here is we have clubbed the data set into various regions. Like, for example, we have clubbed the countries into various regions like North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, South, and Oceanic regions. And in this particular instance, you will notice that when we drill down to UK, one among the three calls get originating from Spain. And in terms of termination, bulk of them are getting terminated to Africa. So this shows you, some sort of pattern which we can actually pick up and then, start looking upon. So now let's look at another pattern from the regional perspective. In terms of home continent, South America contributes the highest number of fraudulent cases. And if you look at, if you drill down to South America region, you would see that a cluster of 3 countries are emerging, both in terms of originating continents as well as terminating. In most instances, the calls were the fraudulent calls were originating while the customer was roaming in either North America or South America or Europe. And again, in all those instances, most of those instances, the calls were getting terminated to Africa, North America, or Europe. Let's look at the next highest contender in the home continent, which is Europe. You would also see that the same pattern is followed in case of Europe. The originating clusters are Asia, Africa, and Europe, whereas the terminating clusters are Europe, Africa, and North America. At this stage, let's ask a question whether this pattern can be generalized, and look into the next contributor here, which is North America. And all of a sudden, you will see that as far as North America is concerned, the previous pattern of clustering is no more there. In fact, almost 2 calls out of 3, which resulted in fraudulent activity, originated within North America and got terminated in North America. Let's scroll up and see which countries got involved as far as North America is concerned. All of a sudden, you will notice that Mexico is at the top. So in most of the instances, Mexican SIMs were victims of fraud, or Mexican subscribers were victims of fraud, followed by Canada. In almost half of those instances, United States was the country wherein which the fraud occurred. And in almost 60% of those instances, the calls were actually getting terminated to Cuba. Now let's look at the same statistics from African perspective. And what you will see is Africa also follows the same pattern as of North America, wherein which more than half, or you can even say that close to 2 by 3rd of the calls were originating and terminating within Africa itself. So this clearly indicates there is a regional trend that is getting emerged on the data set what we have for a year ending the month of October. Let's get back to the presentation and then look at the top 10 originating countries. You would notice that United States, Spain, and Peru has retained their position as compared to the previous data set. You will also notice that France and Canada which were not present in the previous data set, has got into the latest data set, which is the year ending October. Let's go back to the drill down scenario and the interactive application and see what contributes to each of these scenarios. Let's look into the case of the United States. As we saw earlier, in most of the instances, in fact 77% of the cases where the fraud occurred in the United States, the SIMs that got involved were originating from Mexico, and the calls were terminating to Cuba. Now let's look into the scenario of Spain. In case of Spain, it's the United Kingdom and Republic of Korea which contributed to almost 60% of the overall fraudulent cases. And in this instance, you would notice that the calls were getting terminated most preferably to African region. Now let's look at the various trends that we have on the terminating side. In case of terminating calls, Cuba, Tunisia has retained their position as compared to the last time we have calculated. We see Somalia making a jump from 5th position to 3rd position. We see Russia actually slipping from 3rd position to 5th position. Latvia still retaining the 4th position here. Let's analyze what has contributed to Cuba's termination. When you look at Cuba, again, United States emerges as the favorable country from where the calls get originated. Mexico and Brazil are contributing to almost 2 by 3rd of the fraudulent cases relating to the home country. What is also interesting here to see is when you look at the scenario of Iran, you would notice that almost all the calls which resulted in a fraudulent call, which resulted in terminating to Iran, they were originating from Turkmenistan. And in almost all those cases, the SIMs that were involved were from Afghanistan. And if you're familiar with the geography, you would notice that Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Iran share a common border between themselves. So this probably indicates the existence of a syndicate working closely across the border. Now let's go back to the regional view and try and analyze some pattern here. Let's look at Oceanic region as a terminating region. And you notice that in almost half of the cases, the calls were originating from African region. And again, in almost half of those instances, the SIMs from Europe were used for perpetrating those frauds. Now let's look at the scenario from North American perspective. In case of North American, from North American point of view, whenever the call has terminated in North America, the SIMs that were involved were from North America, and they were actually, in almost half of the cases, they were roaming in North American region itself. Now let's look at the scenario from African perspective. In case of Africa, what is interesting here is it's a cluster of more than 3 countries which has resulted in the origination of fraud, as well as as the home region. Now let's look into another pattern which you will see across the data set is Canada, which is appearing as the 11th position in the home country region side, home country side, as well as the 8th position as far as originating country is concerned. Let's analyze what happens when Canada is drilled down as an originating country. You would notice that Canada is almost following the same pattern as United States, with most of the SIMs got involved from Mexico, and most of the calls are getting terminated to Cuba. Now let's analyze let's drill down into Canada as the home country sense. What you'll notice here is there is a difference from the other pattern that we have seen earlier. All of a sudden, you will see that Luxembourg emerges as the top or the hot destination as far as Canadian SIMs are concerned. And Seychelles become the hot destination, hot terminating destinations as far as Canadian SIMs are concerned. And again, the regional trend also drastically changed. Canada no more follows the North American trend of the North American SIMs roaming in North America and terminating calls to North America whenever fraud happens. Canada deviates from it, and in case of Canada, most of the calls, in the fraudulent calls, happens when the Canadian SIMs roam in Europe and make calls to Africa or North America. So with that, I would like to hand over the call to James. Dan, is there any questions?
Yeah, there is a bit of interest emerging in what drives the occurrence of originating fraud in Spain and USA. I mean, they consistently top the charts, and I think there's an interest into any insight that you can provide on what is causing that.
I think we've got two very, very different scenarios there, and interestingly, I see there's also a question about whether we can break out the US a little bit more, because it's such a big area. Understanding that area in more detail might be useful. But certainly the fact that a lot of what we're seeing in the US is about national roaming as opposed to international roaming, and it's possibly related to things like traffic pumping and wholesale fraud. So that's the sort of the US scenario, which is very different to what the types of fraud we're seeing in places like Spain, where Spain is known to be a bit of a hub for people to be making calls from Spain for international revenue share fraud. So in fact, Barcelona, for example, is known to be the sort of European capital of phone theft, where there's a lot of organized fraud going on. Phones are stolen, IRSF is perpetrated with calls going from Spain to numerous countries all over the place associated with IRSF. So very different scenarios.
Okay, thank you, James.
So in the interest of time, I'm going to continue with the slides. And I suspect, Jason, that we may get more questions. We may need to return to your Tableau analysis as we get into the Q&A. So if you do have questions on that area, please make a note of them, and we can return to them when we get to the end. But thank you, Jason, for that.
Thank you, James.
Okay. I better share my screen, and give me a second. Right, you should now be able to see my screen. With the analysis that we've shown you so far, you'll already be in a position to answer those questions that I put up earlier. First of all, do you think there's more fraud at the weekend or less fraud at the weekend? And what we've seen is it's generally higher, in some cases much higher at weekend. And I think if we were to actually look at the value as opposed to just a number of cases, that would be even more extreme. And that's probably what we're going to do later, because we have the data. We do the rating based on IoT. So I generally look at wholesale value as opposed to retail value, and look at the cost of fraud from a wholesale perspective. So that's something for the future. Which month would you expect to be the peak for fraud cases? It's really a little inconclusive. We saw different patterns in different years. Some peaks around June, but not enough to get excited about. Which month would you expect to be the lowest for the number of fraud cases? Again, there's no consistency from year to year to actually make a proper analysis of that yet. But we'll continue doing this. We'll continue publishing the data. And in fact, one of the questions we'll come on to when we run the poll in a minute is the frequency with which we ought to publish this kind of data. which country would you expect to be struck by, for most cases of fraud? From an HP perspective, an HPMN perspective, Brazil is where the subscribers came from, where they have a very major problem. And maybe this will change from year to year, but this is certainly what we've seen in more recent times. Which countries would you expect to have the most cases for originating calls? Spain and USA we've discussed quite a bit, and they were really the major ones in this respect. So I'm going to move on now into the measurement of the value of fraud prevented and how we would recommend going about that. But there's a bit of a mix we're getting into now between that topic of how we measure value of fraud prevented and also the questions that we would like to poll you with. So while I take you through this, let me ask you a couple of questions. So the first is, please could you answer on the poll that you should now see on your screens about whether you think the industry needs a standard measure for fraud. It's a simple yes or no. Just tick the, check the yes or no box, and then in a moment we'll be able to publish the results on that. Some people think that it's unnecessary, there doesn't need to be any standardization. But I said at the outset of the presentation that operators generally have an appetite for sharing information. And if we don't do this consistently, if we don't have a consistent language for this, then it becomes very hard to draw comparisons. And there are so many different ways in which people look at this. Are they looking at retail values, wholesale values? Are they including cases which have not been closed or are open? Are they extrapolating the data over time? There are so many differences. What I'm calling for here is some standardization in the way we actually measure it, which will help people to see how they're performing. And it's not necessarily the absolute numbers that matter, it's the trends that matter, and that's what we want to be able to illustrate. So we've closed the poll now, and in a moment we'll share with you the results. And what you're seeing is that in general, those who've answered, the great majority are asking for some standard measure of fraud for the industry. So I think we'll pursue that. We'll certainly go out on a limb and put out what we think should be the standard measure, because then people are in a position to say they like it or they don't like it. If we don't do anything, then we never make progress. So that's the first question. The next question is about the average duration of fraud. So the question here is, what do you think globally, not just for your company or your country, globally, what is your estimate for the average duration of fraud that's left undetected? Is it 6 hours? Is it 12 hours? Is it 30 hours? And I hear a variety of opinions, and I suspect we'll get a bit of a spread on this one. Again, it's important to have a measure, because if we know how long a typical fraud lasts, then if you're able to say that you are stopping fraud in 2 hours, and if you know that a typical fraud lasts 24 hours, you've saved yourself 22 hours of fraud. And if we standardize in this way, we can actually say how much fraud are we preventing. Far more valuable to say how much fraud have you prevented rather than saying how much fraud have you detected. I said at the beginning of the presentation, as we detect fraud faster and faster and faster, it looks like the values are dropping and we're not bringing so much value to the company. But actually, I think fraud departments want to be able to show their CFO that they are bringing a lot of value and that this is how much fraud they think they're preventing. So check those boxes, indicate where you think it lies. And in general, remember this, that fraud in some countries is not being detected over weekends. People don't always man their fraud departments over weekends, and a lot of fraud happens at weekends. And because this is a global view, and some operators are less diligent than others over manning their fraud departments all the time, you actually see that a lot of fraud continues longer than you might expect. So there have been surveys recently that I've seen which indicates that fraud is lasting rather longer than you might expect. And yet in many areas, I talk to operators and they are shocked at how long frauds last. They say, we would never let it last that long. We stop fraud much faster. So there's a spread. Now, we've closed the poll, and in a moment, we'll show you where it lies. I assume, Dan, that everyone's going to see the results when they come up, but I don't need to read out the details of the results. But I'll
That is correct.
Okay, so what we're seeing is actually that the winner here is on 24 hours. A lot of people are saying 24 hours could be the typical case, case duration time. For a few even saying 30 hours, and quite a few saying 12 hours. So that's a good spread there. My gut feel is that we should be aiming at about the 18-hour, 24-hour point as a reference point. And really, if we all use this consistently, it doesn't matter whether we're right or wrong. What matters is that we are consistent about the way we use it. We take a reference point, and that's what we use for measuring fraud going forwards. So what we're trying to do is to say, if you know the value of a case per hour, I mean, even if you stop it in half an hour, you can still extrapolate and say the hourly value of this case is 100. If we reduce the time the case lasts by 22 hours or 20 hours, you multiply it, and you say that is the value of fraud prevented. Now, if we do that consistently, we can look at the trends in fraud going forwards. That's the aim of what we're trying to achieve here. The third and final question is, again, if you could submit your answer on the polls, we'd be very appreciative of that. We think there is some value in publishing the data. We don't want to swamp you in information all the time. So the frequency of which we provide this information is important, and we'll try and do it consistently. And we can do it both through these webinars and also through papers that we'll publish. And on this occasion, we're going to do both. You'll receive from us a paper with this data, as Dan mentioned at the beginning, so you've got something to take away from this. But should we be holding these sessions or publishing data monthly or maybe annually or somewhere in between? Let me know what you think. And also, if you've got more that you'd like to say about this kind of thing, I'd welcome your feedback. I'll provide you with email addresses at the end. So if you have an opinion of what we should be sharing or other things we might want to consider, like, for example, earlier someone was suggesting we provide more of a breakdown across the states of the US, which is a good idea. We should look at doing that kind of thing. I don't know whether we can, but we'll look into it. And then we will try and provide the data that you would find most useful. So the poll has now been closed, and in a moment we'll share with you where the results fall on how frequently we should be sharing data with you. I should do a drum roll at this point so that we can announce this properly. So in general, quite a few people are asking that we publish results monthly. There are others who are saying every 3 months. We need to look at that, and we'll also look at the results from the earlier session we held today and provide the information as optimally as we can. But as I say, if you've got other feedback on that, we'd love to hear it from you. So if I may conclude from this presentation, what we have shared with you today is that there is no noticeable seasonality. There are some peaks and troughs, and in some years there's marked seasonality, but other years there's completely the reverse. And also, events can happen which substantially distort the data. The days of the week most certainly do have a trend that's repeated year on year. There seems to be a little bit of a peak around midweek, but there's certainly a peak at weekends, and we need to be vigilant against fraud at weekends. We think that it's very valuable to understand the countries associated with fraud, because if we know where fraud is originating and terminating, and if we know there are particular patterns which, if people are making frequent calls or many calls to these locations, they could be indicative of fraud, and that helps us to set up our fraud management systems effectively to detect fraud more effectively. But of course, there are always exceptions, and of course, we've got to look out for the new cases and the new countries that come in with new frauds arising. And we've had the average hours duration consensus, and we're probably looking at saying a typical fraud might last around 18 hours, 24 hours, something in that region. So that's the conclusion to today's presentation. We still have some minutes left if you have any questions. So we'd love to hear from you if you have questions you'd like to ask through the online tool. Submit them online and we will read them out, and we can keep them anonymous if you prefer.
James, you've addressed the point about the vastness of the United States and how we can look at that in the future. But also there is interest in, what is it about Brazil? Is it something to do with SIM configuration there? Is the HPMNS profile set up? Some suggested answers within that question. Have you got any insight on that one?
Yeah, the Brazil one's a bit weird. I know they were having a problem. I don't know whether it still applies, but they were having a problem. The way the regulator was working out there was he put KPIs on the operators to say, you must fix problems or you must provide service within a very short time, which means that the operators are not given the time to do due diligence. And that leaves them wide open to social engineering and people manipulating. So they might call in and get themselves roaming rights before an operator would actually want to give them roaming rights, or they're given service when they're perceived as a risk, and the operator ideally would not give them service. So the operators have been forced into an awkward position in Brazil. I'm not sure whether that's still the case. They may have corrected it by now, but it certainly was an issue there.
Yeah, that's right, James. And if you read it along with the global events that were happening during that time frame, we had Copa America happening somewhere earlier this year. And in fact, bulk of the cases that we have reported from Brazil actually happened during that period. So this regulator putting pressure on the operator, and at the same time you have surging roaming volumes or roaming traffic because of a global event. These two things, when they came together, Brazil ended up in being at the top position.
How could I have forgotten the Olympics? Of course, that's bound to could well have had an influential effect on this. Yes, absolutely right, Chief.
Absolutely. James, another question. Is IRSF the only type of fraud being seen today? What other types of fraud are Syniverse seeing?
No, it's certainly not the only type. Although IRSF is a very common type of fraud. We've seen PBX hacking, for example. We had an interesting situation where we told an operator that there was fraud going on. They came back and said, no, that's not fraud. We saw the case escalating. We went back to them and said, we're highly suspicious. And what we later found out is each time we went to the operator, they went to their customer and checked, and the customer said, no, we're happy, everything's fine. What they didn't realize is that they'd had their PBXs hacked. You've probably all heard these scenarios before. And so they were actually losing a lot of money. And ultimately they came back and said, oh, it was fraud. And it's not always obvious that it's fraud when a customer says, no, we're happy, we're not committing fraud, we're a good customer. So sometimes you have to persevere on these things. We've seen an awful lot of SIM boxing, of interconnect bypass, which some would regard as not fraud. It's more an abuse than fraud. And as I mentioned earlier, it's quite possible that the data we're seeing in the US is relating to traffic pumping and wholesale fraud of different kinds. So it's a variety of things that are happening out there.
Okay, I think we may have time for just one more question, and it's an obvious one, but a good one. Cuba stands out so strongly, and there's sort of two questions in one, really. What drives that? And surely, as it is so standout, have there been any attempts to mitigate the amount of terminating traffic that goes into Cuba?
It's interesting. If you talk to the operators in Cuba, there's a sort of denial that there's any problem. But I think the real problem is it's just the high termination rates. And the high termination rates makes it an attractive proposition for carrying out some of this fraud. As the relationship develops with the US and broader, as they become more integrated, if you like, with the world, those termination rates will drop and the fraud will drop. But until that happens, there's not much you can do about it as far as I can see. Okay.
And another quick one, we would like a definition of traffic pumping.
I'm not the most expert person in this area, but what's happening is people are putting through more traffic than they should be. They're putting through traffic that doesn't really exist across the interconnect to increase the benefits that they're getting through the interconnect rates. That's my understanding of it, but as I say, I'm not really an expert in that area.
Okay. Right. Maybe one more. We talked about Brazil as one of the most impacted countries. Do these countries know about their positions in these statistical rankings? Are they aware of how they feature quite so prevalently?
I would think so. I mean, I think that they generally do know. I can't speak for Brazil. Certainly in the UK, we know that there's all the operators know there's a big problem, and it's the way the number ranges are done. The number ranges leave the UK open for all sorts of abuse, and that has led to all sorts of problems, and they're acutely aware. I know, for example, that a lot of fraud was associated with Latvia, mind you. I think that's more on the termination side. But again, they were encouraged to do something about it. The regulators became involved, and they've addressed it. So I think in most cases the countries do know. In some cases they may be in denial. In some cases it's just because of the way the situation is, rather like I described with Cuba. Yeah, I think the countries involved generally know the situation. But what's interesting is when we have this opportunity to stand back above it all and look at the trends in a more widespread way. Because if you're an operator and your subscribers are roaming out to any country in the world, you can't possibly know everything about every country in the world to detect the fraud. And that's where it's helpful, I think, to see this global perspective of what's going on.
Okay, we're going to have to call it a day there. There are some outstanding questions. We will respond to those by email follow-up. But James, if you just would like to share your contact details, and then we'll bring the webinar to a close.
Thank you for reminding me of that. Yes, so please do feel free to get in touch with Jason or with me. Use those emails that are there. It's just our first name and last name at Cineverse.com. We'd love to hear from you if you have any feedback on today's session, or if there's something a little different you'd like to hear in the next session, or any other feedback or questions. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much for joining us today.